Okay, we've got just about half an hour for our discussion. I don't want this to be a straight Q&A with Tim. I'm sure Tim would probably enjoy it more if it wasn't as well. I want us to actually explore these ideas that Tim put out. If you've got questions which you really want to clarify, please do put them forward. But I also want you to, if there are things that this presentation's brought up in your mind, Randolph's comments, if there are ideas that you're working with which you think are relevant, please throw them into the mix. I want this to be an open discussion. And what I'd like to do is to take 2 or 3 comments at a time. Okay, so I see 1, 2, 3. Great.
Thank you. Theoretically a question, but I think the...
If you could say your name and organisation.
The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a customs and tax consultant, formerly ex-HMRC, and I've worked on a World Bank project in... World Bank managed project in Yemen, DFID founded. Superb stuff from both gentlemen. I'd just like to ask... couple of questions. Number one, are you going to take a list of which government departments are going to be present at your speech tonight and which are not, and ask those who aren't why not? And secondly, using a phrase that Tom Clancy uses in all the works that he wrote himself, one of 2. The first one is, why didn't the dog bark? In other words, it's the absence, it's what isn't there as well as what is. That. The second one is, there's no substitute for looking someone in the eye. When you put your points, and I say you, because I said generically, I think both gentlemen's comments are incredibly relevant. When you put your comments to your former colleagues at the World Bank, what did you see in their eyes? Thank you. Can I just say also that I find the FT is a marvellous intelligence.
I will pass that on. Thank you.
Thanks. Claire Malamed from ODI. Thanks to both of you. I thought that was really excellent. I don't think it's probably a first for, I think we've never had toaster design as a subject for an ODI lecture before, as far as I know. 2 comments, really. First of all, I think there's sort of 2 additional issues, problems, areas in trying to think about this approach and the difference that it might make to how we try to do development and aid in particular. I mean, the first one is, bearing in mind big vaccines conference going on today at number 10, the sort of hype this week around vaccines as something which we know works. It's cheap and it works. And I can see that, if one's thinking about the kind of morality of aid and of public spending in general, and one's choosing between something which we already know works and is cheap and is very effective, and something which we don't know if it's going to work or not. It could end up being even better than vaccines, but maybe it won't. And in terms of trying to spend limited resources in a situation of great need, there's a sort of difficulty there, which applies to all public policy, but particularly, to areas of very great need, like development. And secondly, I think there's an additional issue in trying to apply this to development, which is around, you're talking about distinguishing between success and failure. I think sometimes there's a tendency, and I was particularly struck by when you talked about the microcredit example, in when one sees that something is failing, one can either try to change it, or given how complicated development is and how many different objectives there are going on at the same time, one can also just change the objectives and redefine what would have been as failure by your previous objectives. If you change the objectives, it can look like a success. And sometimes that's wrong, sometimes that's right. I mean, you can see something similar happening with microcredit. Okay, so it's not necessarily being used for investment, but maybe it's just people borrowing for consumption, and maybe that's okay. So one can also change the objective. So I'm not quite sure where this gets you, but I think these are just some additional issues in trying to actually sort of operationalise some of these ideas in development.
Have you got another one?
Thank you. I also very much enjoyed the presentation. My name's John Burton. I'm with KPMG. I used to work with DFID for quite a long time until recently. I had a couple of questions for Tim, really. One was, what is new in your thesis here? I recall Bill Easterly doing a thing about planners and searchers in international development, and I took sort of more or less the same big message from his book. But do you have something new, or are you just telling the story in a more, engaging way than other people have done it? And I came slightly with the suspicion that the answer was B and not A, but I would be very happy to be challenged on that. And then the three stages from Palczynski I thought were great. I just wondered if there's kind of a fourth stage, that once you know the difference between success and failure, how do you stamp out the failure and replicate the success? And I think DFID became pretty successful actually with its decentralized structure, which allowed a lot of innovation. But as soon as it tried to say, well, we must be able to aggregate and measure everything and replicate the successes, then it went in completely the opposite direction and possibly threw out its baby with its bathwater. But do we have a stage 4 that really works to stamp out failure and replicate success? Thanks.
Great, thank you. Tim, do you want to take a few more and reflect back
Well, we've already had 6 questions, I think, from 3 people. So
why don't you jump in?
Let me see what I can say. So I will pay attention to who comes to the Institute for Government event. I have spoken to the Cabinet Office already last week, so I think that they are paying attention to this. It is interesting, the message that keeps coming back is, yeah, we get it, but when we speak to the ministers, they want something that works really quickly and they don't have an evidence base. And what will happen is they will then do something without an evidence base. If they're smart, they won't produce an evidence base, since things done without an evidence base probably won't work, and failures are embarrassing to politicians. And then 2 years later they'll be into a different job, and then the next politician will come in and will say, I need to do something, and they'll say, well, there's no evidence base, and the cycle repeats itself. So it's a problem. So Claire raised this point about might we end up just spending all of our money on stuff we know works? I mean, it is a risk. It's worth pointing out that the advanced market commitment, which is part of this vaccine fund, this was money for a vaccine that didn't yet exist, although we strongly suspected probably would exist in the near future. And in principle, that could be extended to vaccines that do not exist and we don't know whether they will ever exist. And in fact, I advocate that as part of the chapter on innovation. Innovation prizes are very powerful, because you don't need to spend the money until you actually get the thing that works. But I mean, really, it's a theoretical possibility that we spend all our money only on proven successes and we don't ever take any chances with anything else. I think a bigger risk at the moment is what you might call the God complex, or you might call excess certitude. So there's this wonderful literature on excess certitude. Excess certitude is basically when people report results as though they knew the answer, when in fact they don't. And it could be anything to do with excess precision. The US Congressional Budget Office says, well, if you pass this law, this is what this law is going to cost, and they round it to the nearest billion. It'll be 872 billion, and of course then it could be anything between about 300 billion and 1,500 billion. They really don't know, but they report it to the nearest billion. And the cost of excess certitude, basically they've made lots and lots of supporting assumptions to get it to that precise level. The policymaker reads that and says, well, 871 billion, it sounds like you guys know. And therefore, when somebody comes along with a begging bowl saying we need to do some research, the politician says, well, but I've got this figure. No, we know. We already know. So I think the problem more is that we fund stuff that we don't know whether it works, but the politicians do think it works because of the way messages are presented to them. As for changing objectives, yeah, you're right. And I mean, there's no easy answer to this, because in some cases, changing objectives is perfectly reasonable. If you were wanting to do something and you have this project, and the project then has some other good consequence, but not the consequence you originally wanted, that's okay. You need to be flexible. But at the same time, you don't want to just change your objectives until they sort of consist of, well, we ticked all the boxes and everything was done with proper approval, and therefore, although the project was a colossal waste of money, we nevertheless fulfilled all World Bank criteria, and therefore the project counts as a success. I mean, we don't we don't want to redefine success like that. To John's question, so as far as Bill Easterly is concerned, so I interviewed Bill for the book. I mean, one difference between this book and Bill's book is that this book is mostly not about development. Now, that's possibly not very appealing to this crowd. There's one chapter on development, and there are 7 chapters on the financial crisis, climate change, innovation, and so on and so on and so on. I think the other thing is, I mean, I enjoy Bill's books, and I enjoy talking to Bill, although he can be slightly depressing to talk to at times. I think Bill doesn't give enough credence to the idea that good governance is possible and that institutions can learn and can experiment. I mean, I think he feels that basically none of that can really happen, and the only thing that can happen is eventually an economy will fumble its way towards a working market, and even pro-market, even free market ideas can't be imposed. So, just wait for it to happen. And I think that's too pessimistic. I think organisations can learn. I think institutions can get more familiar with trial and error. They'll probably never be as comfortable with trial and error as we would want from a social point of view, but nevertheless, I think they can. So we have a slightly different view. But mostly, it's got tanks, it's got Spitfires, it's got oil platforms blowing up, nuclear power stations melting down. You'll laugh, you'll cry. I mean, it's not like Bill's book at all. And I don't have anything to add on the question of stamping out failure, except it's clearly an essential part of the process. I'm not an expert on that, but yeah.
Great, thank you, Tim. Randolph.
So very quickly, I just wanted to add a little something to your point about vaccines that work and ideas that may not. Because one of the things that, again, fascinates me in the humanitarian sector is that this ability for humanitarian organizations to engage with the sciences is really, if you like, an area that needs to be looked at far more carefully, far more consistently. And in a sense, what is fascinating from the humanitarian perspective, or should be, is that all that expenditure of science that really could be useful, both in terms of warnings as well as opportunities, solutions, etc., just go in parallel. Sometimes scientists are led in the room, very rarely are they at the table. And I think this is underscored by a March 2011 Parliamentary Select Committee on Science and Technology, who said, basically, when you deal with crises in this country, where are the scientists? And I think that's, if you like, just sort of saying you don't have to do one or the other. Isn't it amazing how much one could actually grab onto now, while perhaps pursuing ideas that are acceptable and sound at this stage?
Just a quick reflection before I hand back to you all on redefining objectives. I mean, it's a key part of innovation. Is the thing that you actually come up with may not be applied in the situation that you, or in the way that you think about. And just 3 that I can come immediately to mind: tea bags, text messaging, and treatments for male impotence were all originally.
And that's just from the T in the dictionary.
that's just things starting with T. But also one of my favourite innovation quotes, and just because it's so touching, is Alexander Graham Bell, who said, "One day I think there may well be a telephone in every town in America." Alison and Mike. Thank
you. Alison Evans, Director of ODI. Tim, thank you very much for that. You have absolutely underscored my faith in storytelling and as you said, the sort of powerful role of evidence as a buttress to really good rhetorical positioning. And I thought you did a really good job. I want to pick up actually a little bit on what John said, and I've been sort of thinking about 3 books that I've read of late, well actually 2 and one I'm going to read, which is yours. The one by Cohen and Easterly on what works in development, the other by Duflo and Banerjee, Poor Economics. Terrible title, I don't know where they came up with that, but fascinating book.
Maybe they forgot to run a randomised trial.
And your own. And one thing that strikes me about something that is common to all of them is, in a sense, and maybe you could push back and say this, you don't think this is what they're about, but to some extent is the rejection of the big idea. That actually, change that is progressive, positive, sustaining is actually the result of the aggregation of lots of little ideas. And you would go further and say not only just little ideas, but lots of trial and error. Now, I think that's really interesting. For a start, for many of us working in development, it immediately sort of starts to challenge us around notions that democracy is it, macroeconomic stability is it, the Washington Consensus was it. Those big ideas are losing currency clearly day by day. But it does point then to the question of what are the aggregators? What do we need to have in place that allows all these mini experiments and small ideas to really come together in the kind of powerful cocktail that we now see that lies behind the 10 billion products that are sold in New York every year or traded. And clearly the market is an aggregator. But what are the implications for public institutions, and what do they need to do better in order to be better aggregators of all these small ideas?
Great, thank you, Alison. Mike, Sheila, and then,
Hello, Mike Powell from IKM Emergent Programme. Like everyone else in the room, I think I really enjoyed the presentation. But I have to, and maybe it's the job of the speakers to pose questions, and I don't quite see the level of consensus that some of the others have suggested is in the room, or even really come away with a very clear message from what you were saying. Because to begin with, as you talked about failure, and success and failure, and how it could happen to anyone, including very progressive organizations like Atari in very fast-growing markets. It was almost implying that it was random. In fact, I think you did say that it could be random. And I thought, well, it can be, but it can also be, there's a real difference between some organizations that make an effort, some organizations that act intelligently, some that have ideas about what knowledge is, understanding of their markets and their sectors. Mm-hmm. And these, to me, are rather relevant factors. So I was kind of saying, well, I'm not sure if he's given quite enough credence to knowledge and things like that. And then you actually end your presentation with what I almost saw as a contradictory position on the importance of evidence, saying that if you do the research, it's there, it's very clear, it's vitamin B12, not vitamin C. And I was saying, yeah, but so women and poverty and child health, there isn't a B12. Even the vaccine is only a partial thing. And that, you can say, respond to Claire's point, you can't spend all your money on things you work, because a lot of your problems are things you don't even know what the problem is, let alone what works. And if you only spend on vaccines, that's not going to create any development in the world. And I actually think there was some differences on the panel, because you were saying about evidence base as a killer of creativity, and the wish to go for recognize and understand intuition. But you and I were also both nodding about having a good kick at the God complex. So it's what I'm trying to say. It's a kind of complicated, more complicated, and I think it needs to be clarified, particularly for this evening. And I would suggest it has connections with knowledge, the importance of knowledge, but also it's the diversity of it. Evidence as a plain fact only applies to certain sorts of circumstances. Social and economic reality cover a much wider set of circumstances. So what is the problem? What is the evidence? And in particular, again, going back to what works and what doesn't, and whether it can then be aggregated and built up, just so many circumstances are specific. And unless one recognizes that and is free to work in those circumstances, then the solutions that the US Army came up with in Iraq maybe aren't going to be working in Afghanistan.
Can you do that in 2 minutes, Tim? No, I think we've got a couple more, but we've got one here, and then Sheila, and then we'll come back for reflections from them.
Thank you. My name is Nzita. I'm an independent economist. Tim, thank you very much, really, for reminding us about In Search of Excellence, which I would say was Mao Zedong little red book of the 80s, because you have to read it. And probably in future, maybe you can recall as Lee Iacocca biography as well, because the two books quite related. Yeah. So now my question there is this about the God complex idea. Is there a difference between a positive dictator, a negative dictator, and the idea of God complex. And finally, you talk about the Second World War. I think someone here can help us here. I think Winston Churchill is a pioneer, I would say, of accepting a failure. Because if I do remember reading one of his biography, one of the weapons they were producing in Britain was not working. And people called him, and then I think he said, oh, in that case, give it a name, Winston Churchill. So he was honest. So I think maybe I can agree with you that we should be honest to accept failure sometimes. Thank you.
Thank you.
And one more from Sheila.
Thank you. Sheila Page, ODI. You passed over what struck me as potentially the most interesting and complicated problem, which was defining success and failure. Because over-rapid and over-simplistic defining of success has been a problem, certainly in development, but not only in development. And it does notoriously lead to distortions and to wrong policy. But even in medicine, death is usually a fairly clear indicator, but for anything short of that, I was recently on a Cochrane lay panel, and we had great difficulty coming to any agreement on quality of life, because this was a treatment that wasn't going to kill or cure, it was going to affect that. And that was the interesting discussion. So trying to define success surely is much more important in a sense than afterwards trying to do the trial to measure it, because there are always going to be a great many measures, a great many definitions of success. I mean, even within this room, we'll find more than one definition of success in development. And that, I would have thought, was a more interesting point to look at.
Okay, Tim.
So I've spoken about the book about 20 times over the last couple of weeks. I'm not sure I've ever had quite so many varied and penetrating questions. So forgive me if I just sort of just think really hard. Let me see where I can go with this. Thank you, everybody. I mean, on Mike's point, differences of opinion are good. We like differences of opinion. There's a wonderful study where you may well be aware of the original study by Solomon Asch, the psychologist, the Conformity Experiment, which I discuss in talking about what happened in Iraq, where so Asch had these cards. So one card had 3 lines on, A, B, and C. They're slightly different lengths. Well, fairly different lengths, actually. And the second card just had a reference line. And the question was, which of these 3 lines, A, B, and C, is the same length as the reference line? So Asch got this group of young men together from Stanford. This is the 50s. So he goes to the first guy, and the first guy says A. And the second guy says A, and the third guy says A, and the fourth guy says A. And there's this guy sitting on the end of the table who's starting to get a bit nervous because the answer is obviously B. And he doesn't, he starts to sort of crack up under the stress. And it turns out all these people were actors. And Solomon Asch had created this situation where they all, it's the conformity experiment, they all conformed on the wrong answer, and finally the guy at the end would crack and say, yeah, it's A, it's A. It wasn't clear whether he changed his mind or just didn't want to rock the boat. Now, the great follow-up experiment, first by Solomon Asch, where you would go around and would go A, C, A, and then you go to the guy at the end who's the actual person being experimented on. The real answer is B. So you've heard A, C, A. No one said the truth yet, but they have at least disagreed with each other, and much more often the guy on the end would say, yeah, B. B's the answer. Didn't need anybody to agree with him. He just needed them to disagree with each other. And then he could, so to the extent that Randolph has disagreed with me, thank you. I mean, I know, we were of one mind, but, it was really profoundly important for everybody else.
Tim, it's A.
So later on, there was a follow-up where they actually managed to establish beyond any reasonable doubt that one of the guys in the experiment was functionally blind, couldn't see at all. And this was the guy in the experiment who, A, then the blind guy says C, and A, and you finally go to the guy at the end who's being experimented on. Everyone else is an actor. and he will still say B. It doesn't matter that the disagreement was clearly not credible. Just as long as there was disagreement. So dissent is really important for generating this variety and enabling people to speak their minds, which is part of all this this qualitative feedback that is so important. Because you're clearly concerned, and Sheila was concerned about the idea. Well, it can be hard to actually pin this down and put a number on it. A lot of it is much more touchy-feely. So you still need good processes that are going to surface disagreements and actually produce feedback and let people tell the truth about what they believe. I don't think the fact that sometimes evidence comes from a randomized trial indicates that failure isn't random. I mean, failure is pretty arbitrary. The randomized trials are a way of harnessing failure in a very controlled way to produce evidence. It's clearly not the only way to produce evidence. And clearly, once you have evidence, you want to use the evidence. So I'm not saying you just start from scratch every time. Every day you get up in the morning and you say, let's just assume I know nothing. I don't know how to make a cup of coffee. I have no useful knowledge. The world is too complex. I just need to experiment my way through the day. You're building up this library of knowledge. That's absolutely true. In competitive markets, the challenge is that you need to be ahead of everybody else who's also building up a library of knowledge. So that's why, at the margin, it looks so random and arbitrary. And clearly, these firms are not behaving in random ways, but the results can look quite random because they're competing against the best of the best. So what else? Zita talked about Churchill pioneering failure. There's a lovely story about Churchill in the book, actually, where he campaigns vociferously against the Spitfire on the grounds that this is a technology that will never ever work. No. And what he wants is the Boulton Paul Defiant to be built, which is this plane that, let's just say, English schoolboys do not thrill to the name of the Boulton Paul Defiant, but we still make Spitfires out of little sort of the plastic kits. And Josca's a really, really smart person, a very influential person, advocates one thing. This comes to the God complex. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the right answer. And the Spitfire got built. This is incredibly brilliant technology. The Spitfire got built because there was this remarkable and quite unusual culture of pluralism in the British Air Ministry. There's this guy called Air Commodore Henry Cave Brown Cave, who's, I imagine, with this big sort of twirly moustache. Air Commodore Henry Cave Brown Cave gets this proposal to build the Spitfire. There's absolutely no evidence to believe that the thing is going to work. It's attempting to do something that everybody believes probably can't be done, and doing it in a way that everybody believes if it could be done, that's certainly not the way you would do it. So it's a real long shot. And Air Commodore Henry Cave Brown Cave says, well, it's the most interesting experiment, let's do it. They spend £10,000 on it, which is the cost of a house in London at the time. And it probably saved the lives of about 500,000 Jews who were living in Britain at the time the Nazis tried to invade and couldn't, largely because of the Spitfire. So this pluralism is really, really important. It's not just about what evidence you can produce. It's about creating disagreements, creating lots and lots of new ideas, backing them, and then seeing what comes out. I'm very much in sympathy with Sheila. There's no answer, really. The world's a really incredibly complex, multifaceted place. We cannot, in the end, quantify everything and define success versus failure rigorously. Not everything can be solved with a randomized trial, but we still need feedback mechanisms and experimental mechanisms, whether they're informal or formal. And mostly in the book, I talk about informal experimental mechanisms, just diversity, decentralization, and so on. And in the end, it's going to be a judgment call. It's going to be somebody who you hope has the wisdom, who you've done your best to give the best possible information, who's seen several different things tried out, is then going to make the decision. I guess Alison's question is the most challenging question of all. How do we scale up what is basically a very small idea? There are a few things one can say. And one is, to an extent, the scientific method is a scaling up of formal experimentation. I mean, you could say that the randomized trials and generally experimental method, replication, falsification, trial registries, peer review, These are all institutions that are helping the scaling up of the formal experimentation process, which is not the only experimentation process, absolutely. So that, science has got these things going. In development, we're starting to get there, but we're a long way away from the proper these proper institutions that verify evidence and evaluate evidence. Something I'd really like to see is like a fair trade logo for experimental data. We could maybe have a silver star and a gold star that just tell politicians who really don't need to understand the scientific method that this evidence is pretty good stuff. It had a reasonable sample size. It's been peer reviewed. This is real gold standard stuff. It's and I don't know who sets that and what committee applies the silver ribbon and the gold ribbon, but I think that would really help to produce that shorthand for people who don't necessarily have the time or the expert knowledge to evaluate the evidence base by themselves. I feel that I haven't fully answered everyone's question, but I also feel I've just been talking far too long and want Randolph to say something.
And it is a complex world.
We're
not expecting you to find all the answers. I think everyone can agree with that. Randolph.
Because of Tim's thoroughness, I'll be unbelievably short. It's just, I too was intrigued by Alison's question, and I don't know if there is a way you can consciously aggregate it up, but I do wonder if somewhere between the zeitgeist and the paradigm, etc., these things come together, and I don't think they can necessarily be forced. Don't know, but that's one answer. Thank you very much. You picked out the difference, but which really wasn't, I think you picked out my anxiety, that there's a certain cultural phenomenon that actually says evidence is, if you like, the starting point. And what I'm saying is I think wisdom is the starting point, and evidence then has to sustain that wisdom or not. But it's, I've seen too much, be it the DFIDs, be it elsewhere in government, this idea that let's start off with something which we can get evidence from, and then we'll prove the point. When I'm looking for, let's start off with wisdom. So that's my idea there. The other thing, just as a by the way, Tim, Panamundum also is fascinating, because basically here was another mistake or issue where Churchill, if you like, said because of his chief scientist, there is no reason to attack this. The Germans could not have the V2 capacity that was needed to bomb England. And quite clearly, there was one sole voice that said, oh, yes, they do, and Panamundum was ultimately bombed. So my only point is, Spitfire positive, Panamundum negative, but it was the lone voice that actually made so much of a difference. And then, Sheila, one of the things that fascinates me about all this kind of failure successes, do we know the consequences of one set of, what's the time scale of a success? What's the time scale of a failure? And I just, in this context, we had to deal with this once again in the DFID review, and how do you measure outcome? And at what stage does outcome actually, if you like, have that longitudinal strength that actually means that it's a viable outcome?
Yeah, there are randomized trials in America that have been running for 50 years. They're still tracking outcomes. I mean, but no politician has the patience to wait and find out.
I think we've got a comment from online viewers. Malcolm?
Yeah, we do. Just a question, a comment and then a question from Rebecca Wilkins, who's from the International Planned Parenthood Federation, which is based in London. With aid agencies placing increasing focus on results-based financing and value for money, this is producing an environment that is becoming more and more risk-averse. How can we overcome this challenge in being able to finance innovative and experimental approaches?
Could you hear that?
Can you just say the last bit again?
How can we overcome this challenge in being able to finance innovative and experimental approaches? Talking about the risk-averse culture within development and how we might be able to get beyond.
Is there something on this in particular? Okay. Well, do we have any reflections on that?
Well, yeah, it's good to I mean, that's a tragedy to the extent that that's true. And I think one can set up expectations in advance. You know, one can say, and this is something that medicine has sort of slowly fumbled its way towards a sort of mode of operating here. You can say, look, the results that we're hoping to get out of this is information. We're going to run a pilot and we're going to find out whether it works or not. We've got good reason to think it might work. And Randolph, your point on wisdom, I think, is absolutely essential. I mean, you don't just do 1 million trials and on the basis of no knowledge whatsoever. You have some inspiration, you have an idea, you have that spark about what's going to work. And but then, rather than just going, I'm just so brilliant, it's bound to work, you say, well, let's do it. And while we do it, let's test it. And I think that the idea that you wouldn't fund an experiment to see whether something works is sort of tragic. But it's got to be sold in the right way in advance. I think we've got to get better at saying, as medics do, we have reasons to believe this might work, and we would like funding to find out if it does. And I think there's nothing to be ashamed of in doing that, and government should be perfectly comfortable with that, and maybe they're not, and that's a battle we need to win.
I think we have one final question we've got time for.
Joe from One. Later this year, most major donors will begin publishing their aid data according to a common standard, and in theory, we hope that will fix some of the feedback loops, and the thousands of products will be OECD definitions for all the different sorts of projects on the ground. I wonder how far you think this type of transparency can help us evaluate success, or whether, as a development community, we may risk drowning in all this new data.
I suspect we won't. I suspect we won't drown in the data. We may or may not find that it's useful. I'm rather optimistic. I think it probably is going to be useful. There are a lot of wonderful geeks out there with computers and spare time who just chomping at the bit to try to produce this kind of analysis. We'll just have to see. And there clearly is a risk that what you measure is not actually what matters, and then because it gets measured and analysed and so on, it becomes the reality. There's a wonderful, wonderful book by John Scott called Seeing Like a State, which is all about how, and it largely describes state planners, but it could equally be somebody high up in a bureaucracy, somebody high up in a multinational company. It could equally be somebody analysing data on the web. But you get this data, you get the map, you get the information, you get the demographic data, and it becomes the reality. And if you're a state, you actually have the power to turn what is a messy situation on the ground into something that actually conforms to your view of reality. You think these are the property rights, and sooner or later they will become the property rights. So I'm very optimistic about it, but I think there is reason to be cautious because clearly not everything can be measured.
If I can just come in there, I mean, the interesting thing about the transparency initiatives that are going on at the moment, how few of them actually are decentralised in the way that we're talking about highly centralised transparency initiatives, which would seem to go against the kind of feedback loops we need to make innovation happen. I don't know, Randolph, if you want to come in.
Just one. Let me use your question as a very brief platform, and that is one of the things that fascinates me in this discussion on really, which is underpinned by complexity and uncertainty, etc., is what are the parameters of this development community? I mean, who is in development given complexity, uncertainty, new ideas that will impact, etc.? And maybe one of the things I take away from this is maybe one really needs to rethink fundamentally those kind of terms as well.
Great, it's 2:30. I'm sure we could carry on talking for much longer. Tim's going on to another talk, and he is going to be signing copies of his book, so he'll be with us for a few more minutes, I think.
Absolutely, they're not just copies. They're actually first editions, and they're first editions. If you want to buy local, they're first editions from Pages of Hackney, my local bookshop. So think of the local business you could be supporting.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. But listen, I want to thank you all, and I'm glad Winston Churchill came up a couple of times because he said something which I think is really relevant and pertinent to what we've been hearing today. He said, the secret to success is to move from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. And I think we in the development community are at least halfway there. And thanks to Tim, we've got a few more ideas about how to deal with the second half. So thank you very much, Tim. Thank you, Randolph. And thanks also to Randolph for his excellent comments.